Hey, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, the final episode of 2021. Excuse me, of 2020. I'm looking ahead too far. I am here live for those of you joining me. I'm happy to have you. And during this episode, which will go on to the podcast in just 2 days, I'm excited to do a countdown of the most listened to or downloaded episodes of the year, and to give you my lessons from the top 5 among them. So if you are with us live, feel free to ask your questions, share your comments. I'll be able to see those and I'll be happy to take those into account. I'm so glad that you are here during the golden week of 2020. So when I was a kid, I was thinking about this earlier this weekend, over the weekend. When I was a kid, every year I looked forward to this time of the year and listened for when the radio stations were going to play America's Country Countdown and Casey Kasem's America's Top 40, where they would count down the top songs of the year based on airplay. And we didn't have the internet. We didn't have Google and Yahoo and all of those things, so we could look those things up. So for the most part, if you wanted to find out what the top songs of the year were, you had to listen to the show. Now, so many things we can figure out, but via Google or some other sort of way, some sort of research. But you can't really find out the answers to these things because the data about the downloads is all hidden behind our screen and in the background for us. So we know exactly which of the episodes that we released this year were the most downloaded this year. And that's how we're doing that. We have some older episodes that were released prior to 2020 that did tremendously well this year. In fact, the most downloaded of the year probably was the episode with Amma Marston about leadership resilience. And probably not surprising that the topic of resilience would have done so well this year. And I would certainly encourage you to go take a listen to Amma's episode. And so I'm going to put this, if you're watching live, you can see it's remarkablepodcast.com. Any of these that we're talking about that you missed, you can go to remarkablepodcast.com and go find them and listen to them. And of course, if you're watching or listening to from wherever, you can go to the playlist and go find those earlier episodes. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to count down the top 10. When I get to the top 5, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my lessons and my memories from those 5 episodes. But before I do that, I thought I'd do some other interesting things, give you some background, give you some data. So among the 10 guests, I will say this as well. If you do watch or listen to the podcast, you know that each week I have a guest, and each week there's at least one episode that's just me, typically relatively short. And so when I talk about this top 10, it does not include any of the only 7 episodes. It includes only the episodes that I had a guest on. So I'm going to talk to you about the 10 most downloaded episodes with guests. And so if it included some of mine, 3 or 4 of these wouldn't have made the top 10. But these are the folks that joined us that people found to be the most valuable. And I want to reward them and recognize them and give those of you who didn't see all of them a chance to get connected to some of these great episodes. So a few things about them. 3 of these episodes were released in January, 3 in February, 2 in March, 1 in April. Probably not a big surprise that the longer the episodes have been, they're more likely to have more downloads. But 1 of the episodes was actually released in June. It was one of the top 5, actually. So the other thing to know about these guests that I have is that while most of them, actually all of them, could be categorized as authors, as it turns out, all of them could be categorized in other ways as well. So 2 of the 10 are professors, would be probably considered their main role in life. 3 of them I think they would consider themselves to be entrepreneurs. 4 of them to be their primary role to be consultants. 3 of them to be business leaders in organizations, not necessarily the entrepreneur or business owner. And then again, all of them would be authors. So some professors, some entrepreneurs, some business leaders, and some consultants. Another way to split the content up would be to say what kinds of topic areas were the most downloaded. And if I can take a little liberty and play with how to organize them just a little bit, I would say that 3 of the 10 were about our role as a leader and understanding that role better. 2 were very specifically about the roles that we play the skills that we have as leaders. And then 5 others that, while they are leadership skills, they would also fall more into the personal development or individual development as well as leadership development categories. So many of them, half of them fully, fall into that category. And so that gives you some background about them. And one other thing, as it turns out, 2 of the top 5 actually have lessons from chickens. Neither of them were about chickens, but 2 of my guests actually, as it turns out, brought up lessons to be learned from chickens. I take that for what you wish, right? So let me now do my best, Casey Kasem, and give you the top 10, starting from number 10. In the number 10 slot was an episode called Leaders as Teachers with Thomas DeLonge. It was a great episode. It came out in March. Number 9 is an episode called Reframing Problems with Thomas Wendelsborg. And this episode was all about how we can think about our problems differently and better to get better results and to solve problems more effectively, all by how we frame them. Very tactical, very practical, very helpful. Number 8 was from Kim Lorenz, Lessons That Drive Business Success. And Kim is an entrepreneur who started a tire company in the Pacific Northwest. And we had a very exciting conversation where we talked about a lot of very practical things. During the course of our conversation, Kim Lorenz in number 8 spot. In the number 7 spot is my colleague, member of my team, and my now 2-time co-author, Wayne Turmel. He came on in the middle of March when the lockdowns related to the COVID-19 situation had just begun to take hold. And we did a special added episode about remote leadership. So it was Wayne Turmel and I about remote leadership. That comes in at number 7. Number 6 is from Jack Modzelewski, where we talked about leadership, communication, and credibility. Tremendous episode talking about those 2 major things for us to keep in mind. How do we make sure we are credible? How do we communicate more effectively as leaders? Jack and I had a great conversation about that, and that came in at number 6. So there's the second 5. Now let's get to the top 5, and we'll talk about each of these a little bit more. I'll go to my notes and share them. And I will also tell you that for all 5 of these, I have listened to all of them again within the last little over a day. We'll call it 36 hours. So I certainly had memories and lessons that I took from them, but I've gone back and watched all of them, listened to all of them again, mostly listened as I was driving, and to hopefully make this a richer and more useful conversation, more richer, more useful episode for all of you. So in the number 5 slot is a gentleman named Zach Thomas. And Zach's episode was called Leader Farming with Zach Thomas. Zach is a franchisee, an entrepreneur with the Chick-fil-A organization. He has a number of Chick-fil-A restaurants. He went to West Point. He was in the service. Is a very interesting guy. What I want to do for each of these 5 episodes, as I count them down for you, is that I sort of did 3 things. I asked myself, why should you listen? What and then multiple things about what I learned or what some key lessons are. So Zach Thomas, I think you want to listen to Zach because he's a very accomplished guy. He's a very driven guy. And yet the conversation that we had about what he calls leader farming Much like me, he said, I'm not really in the business of growing crops or animals. Now I'm in the business of growing leaders. And in that regard, he and I are very much alike. So it's also a good reason to listen to him is that he is a boots on the ground guy. Our conversation was very practical. And I would say that Zach shows up in our conversation as a very principled leader. And I think you'll be inspired by he and I's conversation. So, key lessons that I took from my conversation with Zach. Well, he has a model, as many authors have. And one of the things that he and I talked about was the fact that as a leader, we need to think about there being seasons. Seasons for us in our own development. Seasons in the lifespan of people on your team. Realizing that, and now remember, he is in a fast food organization, to realize that, hey, sometimes turnover isn't always so bad. Maybe it's time for those people to move, give us a chance to bring new people in and help grow them. He talked about the idea that even as plants grow, they need to be pruned. So he's not saying that to be mean to anybody, but I think one of the big ideas that I took from my conversation with Zach was about this idea of the seasons of our career, the seasons of our business, the seasons of our team, and that there's a time to plant, there's a time to harvest, there's a time to prune, there's a time to rest. And I found that to be very valuable in the overall conversation that we had. And one of the quotes that we took from Zach's conversation with us, and again, if you go to remarkablepodcast.com and look up the specific episodes that we're talking about, you can find these quotes. You can capture those and share them in your social media if that's something that you'd like to do. But the quote that we captured from Zach was that risk-taking is the only path to true, authentic leadership. And so I think it's a big lesson to learn from my conversation with Zach that we must, as leaders, as leader farmers, as the grower of new leaders, be willing to take risks along the way. The number 4, actually it's tied for the number 3 most downloaded new episode from 2020 is the episode that I had with Micah Solomon called The Customer Service Playbook with Micah Solomon. And Micah is a consultant and started a company early in his career as well. And he considers himself to be the customer service turnaround expert. So why would you want to listen to Micah and I? Well, if you're specifically interested in customer service in your organization, or you want to take a broader view of customer service, both internal and external, even suppliers in that framework, he's the guy. He brings real life experience, and he has been brought into a variety of organizations to help them turn around customer service when it wasn't going so well. So I would say that the biggest thing I remember from my conversation with Micah was a conversation we had about hiring for customer service success. And before I tell you his metaphor, or excuse me, his acronym that he shared with us, let me remind you that if you're with us live, please give us some thumbs up. Please share your comments. Please ask your questions. I'll be happy to entertain any of those along the way. As right now, we're talking about tied for number 3 most downloaded episode of the year, and that would be Micah Solomon. So Micah said that that while there are certain jobs that absolutely require a technical expertise, we need to hire doctors that know how to be doctors and engineers that know how to be professional engineers and many other things. But he says if you're hiring for customer-facing roles, he believes that there are 5 things that we should be looking for, hiring for, noticing, interviewing for in the context of finding great customer-facing folks. Okay, and he calls it his WET CO. So 5 characteristics. First one is W, which stands for warmth. He says that we need to have people who have a level of warmth and sort of are naturally warm and kind and looking to others in that way. Second, he said they need to be empathetic. And while empathy is important for all of us, certainly for us as leaders, Micah says that that's a great attribute to be looking for with people who are customer facing. It makes total sense. I would agree with him. The third is the T. So far we have warmth and empathy. Then he said teamwork. And the idea is that if your people are going to be facing customers, they need to see themselves as a part of a team. They need to bring the team together to solve problems. They need to not point fingers, but help put that all together. So looking for people who value and are able to exhibit good teamwork. And then the last two, C and O. The C is that they are conscientious, that they care about the work, that they care about the folks, that they want to make sure that they follow through on things. We all have had customer service experiences as a customer where there wasn't follow through, but it didn't feel like someone was conscientious. Mike is saying, let's hire for that attribute. And the last one is what he called optimism, or really a optimistic explanatory style. In other words, people who are customer facing all the time and often will be faced with difficult, challenging situations, that they shouldn't take that personally. They should think about how they can continue to move forward in a positive light, even if there are tough conversations, even if there are, quote, difficult customers, etc. So one of the big things that I took from Micah was his WETCO model, right? Yes. And the question here is, doesn't all of that apply to all of us as leaders? And I think, I don't remember this 100% for sure, but that we talked about that a little bit. And certainly I think those 5 characteristics, warmth, empathy, teamwork, conscientiousness, and optimism, all certainly apply for us as leaders. So I would agree with that. We could argue, or we could have a discussion that says that as a leader, we are automatically customer facing to all of those different constituency groups. So I think it's a really great point, and I appreciate you sharing that. So the quote that we captured and created an image from Micah was that every customer is irreplaceable. And so, the conversation with Micah was a practical and interesting, and yet I think broadening for those who would watch or listen, to broaden our horizons. Okay. And so that's why I think that you should consider, and I would encourage you to consider watching or listening to the episode with Micah. Tied for number 3, and the episode that was released the most recently, so it's had the least time to generate downloads, would be the episode about understanding power with Deb Grunfeld. Deb is a professor at Stanford and wrote a book called Understanding Power. And the book is fantastic, and our conversation was phenomenal. Why should you listen to Deb? Well, you should listen to Deb because you're going to get to hear from a true expert about an important topic, and someone who is incredibly smart and very engaging. I found myself very engaged in listening to the conversation again, even though one of the people speaking was myself. I thought it was a really, really wonderful episode about a really powerful topic. So what did I learn from Deb? Well, we talked about the confluence of power and confidence and influence and positional power, and how all that hooks together for us as leaders. And I think the conversation that we had about the recognition of the fact that all of us have power. And some people feel powerless. Some people don't feel empowered. And yet Deb's definition is that power is a resource that flows between people and relationships. And that while the amount of power we might have with any other person might always be shifting, we always have power. And so when we can understand it at its core, when we can understand it not from a place of judgment, but from a place of what does it actually mean, and how do we use it, I think you'll find it this to be a really incredibly valuable exercise. The part of the conversation where she and I talked about the idea that people that try to grab power, people that probably maybe try to micromanage even, actually feel powerless. And that the more that we are outwardly focused and the more that we're focused on helping other people be successful, the more power we actually have, because people are willing to be committed to our ideas and people are willing to follow us because that we are focused on them. And so that when we try to grab power, it's actually a seeking to gain something we don't feel that we have. But when we're willing to grant power, when we're willing to serve others, that we actually create more power than we might otherwise realize. I found that my conversation with Deb was not only interesting and fun, but I think incredibly useful for us as leaders. And I would highly recommend that episode with her. Okay. That gets us down to the final two. So top 5, Zach Thomas, Leader Farming, tied for 3, Micah Solomon, around the customer service playbook, and Deb Grunfeld talking about understanding power. That leaves us just 2 more. And so let's talk about those final 2, shall we? In the number 2 slot is probably the most famous person that we had on this year, certainly one of the most famous people that we had on this year. His name is Tom Rath. Tom was on with me back in January, nearly a year ago, to talk about his brand new book. Many of you know Tom Rath as the Strength Finders guy, one of the main researchers and leaders of the Strength Finders part of the Gallup organization for a number of years. Why should we listen to Tom? Well, we should listen to Tom. We should listen to this expert because, well, he is a really incredible guy that shares a really interesting, both from a human perspective as well as a leadership perspective, interesting story. He is authentic and genuine. He's clearly smart. He's a researcher of the highest order. And so you're going to get solid information from someone being highly authentic and genuine throughout. And it makes it such a pleasure to have him on. And again, because he's a pretty darn famous guy. So we were happy to have him from that perspective. So Tom's new book is called Answering Life's Great Question, which is the name of his book that came out earlier this year. And the book is all about contribution and understanding how we can contribute and choosing that contribution and what does that look like. So this episode was a higher thinking, a bigger picture conversation, and yet with all sorts of practical applications. So what I learned, I think, from Tom is thinking about contribution as an individual and thinking about contribution as a member of the team, right? And as the guy that many people think of when they think of Strength Finders because of his earlier work in that area, the conversation that we had about helping to get people beyond strengths to what they really can contribute and how they can contribute not only to the team, to those around them, but to the greater world was incredibly useful. Okay. And he shared a quote with us that said leadership, sort of taking his quote and putting it into something slightly shorter, leadership as an investment. He thinks of leadership as an investment in another human being. And when we start to think about it that way, and we start to think about us as, yes, Leah, you're going to definitely want to buy this book. I'll put your note up there. You're definitely going to want to do that. I'd strongly encourage you to do that. And so, again, we're talking about Tom Rath, the second most downloaded episode of the year. And the book is called Answering Life's Great Question. The episode is called Answering Life's Great Question. And I think that while he and I recorded the episode, well, I don't remember when we recorded it, but we released the episode in January. On January, let me just tell you, on the 12th of February. So we probably recorded it in January, if I remember correctly. So when you watch it or listen to it now, it's post-pandemic. When we recorded it, it was pre-pandemic. So if it was in January or February, we certainly had heard of COVID. We certainly didn't know where that was going to go and what that was going to look like. And so I found, as I watched it again, listened to it again, that it was very instructive to think about these ideas of contribution and how we can help our team members to think about how they can contribute. And we had a conversation about the importance of this and the value of this stuff all in a remote context, even though neither of us were prescient enough to know exactly how important the remote work context was going to be for so many during the year. So I think going back to watch this, and listen to this, you will find it to be very interesting as you think about the connection. And we talk about it a little bit in the episode about how when we can help people understand what their contribution is and people can use that information to share with each other, it's a fast way to get deeper knowledge and understanding of each other. And I think we had a really practical, useful conversation just about that one little slice at the end. So the book, again, and the podcast episode is Life's Greatest Question. And in the book, there's an assessment that you get access to. We talked about the assessment, and I actually had Tom talk a little bit about my personal profile and what others could learn about that. We had a little bit of fun with that. So the most watched, listened to episode of the year, of the episodes that were released in 2020 on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, took place in also in February the 26th, with a gentleman named Bruce Paisley, who has a podcast and a book with the title of Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. And so Bruce and I had a wonderful conversation. Why should you want to listen to Bruce? Well, he's a fun guy. And if you care, he has a British accent, and because he's from Great Britain. And he is a tremendous researcher. And so in the book, and he talks about 30 life hacks, 30 ways to make our lives better. And all of them are based on research with data. So he and I talked about the fact that some of these things I already do and I really agree with and we were in alignment on, but it was super nice to know that there's science and there's data and there's research to back up some of these ideas. So I think you'll like it from that perspective is one reason to listen. But what we did was we talked about some of the big ideas in Bruce's book. And he talks about 30 different hacks, ways to improve our life and work in 3 different areas. We talked about three specific of the 30, and then actually we had talked about 4 of the 30. And what I learned, and one of the things that we talked about quite a bit on the episode, is what he calls taking a digital sabbatical. Taking a digital sabbatical. And he's talking about getting ourselves away from our screens for a day. Although he's not saying that you can't look at a screen as much as he's saying, especially in our conversation, we had a long conversation about email specifically and how we've got to be careful with how we use email on the weekend, for example, especially as a leader, because if we start sending email on the weekend, even though we're just trying to catch up, we're setting up all sorts of negative, unintended consequences, including everybody else feeling like they have to work because we are, feeling like if some people are responding, then they ought to respond. And so we talked about the idea of the digital sabbatical for us in general, to get some time away, to turn off the notifications. He told a story about an organization that wanted to do a test and get people, as many people as they could in their organization, to turn off the notifications on all of their devices for 1 week. And they couldn't get people to agree to do it. So they asked people to just turn them off for 1 day. And over half of the people that agreed to turn them off for one day still had them turned off 1 year later. And so it's just a perfect example of the great kinds of stories that Bruce and I talked about based on the research that he has done and that others have done in this area. So one of the many big ideas that you could take from he and I's conversation is that of the digital sabbatical. It was certainly one of the things that I took from it. And the quote that we captured from him in our conversation was, if we can address it, we can improve it. We can improve it. So I think what Bruce and I did was address some things, made us aware of them so that we could work on improving them. And so there it is. We've counted down we've announced the top 10 episodes of the year, and we've talked about the top 5. And so let me just give you those top 5 one more time. Those top 5 are at number 5, Zach Thomas, talking about leader farming, released in January of 2020. Tied for number 3 were Micah Solomon and Deb Grunfeld. Micah talking about the customer service playbook, Deb talking about understanding power. In the number 2 slot, Tom Rath talking about life's greatest question and how we can focus on, understand and focus on our contribution. And the number 1 most downloaded episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast of all the episodes recorded in 2020 was my conversation with Bruce Daisley titled Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, where we talked about what we bring as individuals, not only how we can improve our working strategies, but how that impacts us as leaders and how our leadership role in that can be even greater for everybody. So I hope that you found this valuable, everyone. And I will do here what I do in every episode, which is to end by asking you a question. And that question is, now what? Well, the first now what that I have for you today is I hope that you will say, hey, I didn't see all these. I didn't hear all these. I'm going to go back and check them out. And you can go to wherever you watch or listen to podcasts and scroll through and find them through the playlist to listen. Or you can go to remarkablepodcast.com. I keep saying watch or listen because you can go to remarkablepodcast.com. You can go find them on YouTube and watch all of these. Or you can, of course, listen to them either here or on your favorite podcast app. So now what? What are you going to do as a result? And one of those things I hope is that you're going to go back and download those things. Okay. The question is, isn't a digital Sabbath bad for the economy? I think all that we were saying is that it was really more about us having work-life balance more than anything else, right? So I would argue that if we are more productive on the days we're working, which we will be if we take that digital sabbatical, that will probably actually be okay. Andrea says, I didn't see them all. Well, now you still can, and now you've got those top 5. So whether that now what is I want to go back and watch or listen, or whether you're now what is I want to take action on one of the things that you've just shared here, Kevin, whatever it is, we hope that you will take some action. And we hope that you, if this is the first time that you found us, you'll say, hey, this is good, and I want to be joining in with this group. You can join us on our Facebook group, remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook. You can, if you'd rather do that on LinkedIn, you can go to remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to join our LinkedIn group. Either way, you can be a part of what we're doing, know what we're doing, and be sure that you get access to all of the live episodes that are live. About some percentage of all the episodes in the future will be live. The rest will be recorded. All of them will make their way to you, and we hope that you'll join us in the future for future episodes of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you all soon. Happy New Year.